Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Kamel Daoud's novel, The Meurseault Investigation. Now, this is one I was really looking forward to because I love Albert Camus The Stranger. It's one of my favorite novels, and Daoud is responding to that. The novel is written from the perspective of Harun, who is the brother of the Arab in Camus' novel, the Arab who never gets named in The Stranger. Harun tells us that his brother's name was Musa, and so Musa becomes this sort of dominating, overwhelming presence in Harun and his mother's life, his mama's life. But that's the term that's continually used. And actually, right from the beginning, we have these sort of clear links to Camus' The Stranger. The opening line of Camus' The Stranger famously is, "Maman died yesterday." The opening line here is, "Mama's still alive today." But we've got So this is it's an interesting novel. I actually do think this is a masterpiece of a novel, The Meurseault Investigation. I think it is, along with The Stranger. But in the first 50 pages or so, I wasn't super sold on this book, because initially it felt more like it was an important observation about The Stranger, but it felt more like the kind of thing that lends itself to a postcolonial studies essay, literary criticism, that in Camus' The Stranger, the Arab is never given a name. None of the Arab characters are given any sort of name. There's a ton of assumptions about them. And actually, in my recent video about The Stranger, one of the things I talked about is how the Arab characters almost become a part of the landscape in the novel. So all of that stuff is sort of the focus of the early portion of the novel in the context of French colonialism in Algeria. And it's like, okay, cool, that's good as far as it goes. That's definitely criticism worth making of Camus' novel. But if that was all that the Meurseault Investigation did, it would be okay. It would be fine. I mean, it's a good observation, well worth making. But that's not all that the novel does. Especially as you start moving into the last half of the novel. The first half of the novel is... Okay, so I'll back up a little bit. This novel, The Meurseault Investigation, is basically a monologue from Harun talking to a graduate student in a bar. The graduate student, who's addressed in the second person, so the reader is put in this position. This graduate student has come investigating Camus' The Stranger and the murder that's recounted in it, which in this novel is treated not as fiction, but as historical fact. A murder that really did take place by Meurseault, etc., etc. So Harun is telling this story decades and decades and decades after all of this has happened. I mean, this novel comes out in 2014, and then is translated into English in 2015. So it's set in the 21st century, recounting events that occurred in 1942. And so Harun is quite old by this point, but the first portion of the novel basically deals with the challenges of French colonialism and of the experience of having his brother murdered, how that became the sort of dominating force of his life and his mama's relationship. She became obsessed with finding Musa's body, which was never recovered, finding the location of the murder, which was never positively identified, finding where Meurseault lived, which was never positively identified, etc., etc. And her relationship with Harun is really shaped by this. So that's the focus of the first portion of the novel. It's very much concerned with, again, this sort of speaking back to colonial power and the ways in which colonial violence shaped colonized subjects. But then things actually take a turn and they start getting, I think, much more interesting. We do have throughout the novel these sort of references to Camusian philosophy and different writings of Camus. Let me pull some of them out. But I did mark a number of them. So at one point, for instance, we get Harun's first discussion of religion. He says here, "I'll go so far as to say I abhor religions, all of them, because they falsify the weight of the world. Sometimes I feel like busting through the wall that separates me from my neighbor, grabbing him by the throat and yelling at him to quit reciting his sniveling prayers, accept the world, open his eyes to his own strength, his own dignity, and stop running after a father who's absconded to heaven and is never coming back." That's the absurdist take on religion. And Camus was the definitive philosopher, really, of absurdism. A bit later, we get this reference. We get this phrase, "Whether or not to commit murder is the only proper question for a philosopher, the only one he ought to ask." That's a direct pointing back to Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, probably his major essay, where he talks through absurdist philosophy. That essay, I think, begins with suicide. Whether or not to commit suicide is the only proper question for a philosopher, the only one he ought to ask. So we get these just very direct references. Later on, some of them I'm gonna hold off on for just a second, because especially in the last third or so of the book, there's tremendous overlap that I'm going to talk about. So that's the sort of interesting bit initially, is just this sort of post-colonial observation that the colonized subject is silenced, is erased, is without a name, and also this focus on Harun having to learn French in order to make sense of the story of his brother, having to learn a foreign language in order to understand what was going on with his brother. But there are also interesting mirrorings between Harun and Meurseault. So, one of the instances where we really start seeing this, Harun goes to a beach that he thinks is the one on which Meurseault killed his brother. And there's this interesting, lengthy section here. One of the things that he says, so basically Harun has gone to this beach to try and recreate the experience of Meursault's sunstroke in the famous scene at the end of part 1 of The Stranger, in which he kills Musa. Harun experiences something very, very similar. This sort of disorientation, this physical pain as a result of the sun and the heat. And he has this sort of vision of a figure in the sand that mirrors the vision, mirrors what Meurseault recalls seeing at the time he murders Musa. And what Harun says here, I knew for sure I was looking at a reflection, but I had no idea of what. Now, I think that's really interesting. And what I wrote in the margin here was the Arab Meursault's reflection. More significantly, is Harun Meursault's reflection? Now, I ask that in part because philosophically it's interesting. Meursault's life and identity, his whole world, his whole being comes to be sort of retroactively understood in terms of this murder. Everything about the stranger, everything about Meurseault hinges on this murder. Harun is in the same exact position. Everything in his life, no matter how seemingly disconnected from it, hinges on the murder of his brother. That is the key defining moment of his life. And so, what we start to get in the latter portion of the novel is these increasing parallels between Harun's narrative of his own life and Meursault's narrative of his life in The Stranger. Harun, just like immediately after the end of the Algerian War of Independence, he murders a Frenchman who had sort of taken refuge on their farm. He is put in prison briefly for this. And the imprisonment just completely echoes the experience of Meursault in prison in the second half of The Stranger. We even have this line, I felt thoroughly free in my cell. Again, this sort of existential experience that dominates Meursault's final sort of resolution in that novel. But we've got these references like, I didn't smoke and I hadn't minded when they took my shoelaces and my belt and everything I had in my pockets. Meursault makes those same points, that the guards have taken his shoelaces, his belt, everything in his pockets, including his cigarettes. We go on a little bit later, we have this parody of the incident where Meursault is yelled at by the Christian magistrate who waves a cross in his face and tries to get him to admit that God is real. And Meursault is just baffled by what this man is doing and why. Here, what we get is a colonel of the Algerian, military that's holding Harun. And the big concern that they have is not whether or not he killed this Frenchman, because they don't really care. The big concern is, why didn't he fight in the Algerian War for Independence? Why didn't he join the liberation struggle? The same exact thing happens to Harun with this colonel. He's waving an Algerian flag in his face and berating him in exactly the same kind of terms that the magistrate in Meursault's narrative uses. Harun has fallen in love with a girl named Miriam, who has the Arab version of Meursault's girlfriend's name, Marie. There's so much strong parallelism here. It becomes really interesting and really philosophically problematic, because we start to wonder, what are the implications of this? Does this mean that the colonized is remains fundamentally shaped by the colonial experience and the colonial picture of the colonized. This would be the sort of Orientalist reading, I suppose, this idea that, like, the image that the colonizer has of the colonized subject comes to shape that colonized subject's self-conception. It becomes the act of colonialism becomes an act through which the colonizer redefines who and what the colonized culture is. Is that what we have going on here? Is Harun still fundamentally working from the definitive framework created by French colonialism? That's one possibility. We also have another possibility raised, which is about the trustworthiness of Harun as a narrator in the Meurseault investigation in general. One of the things that he talks about is that he and Miriam, and then he on his own later on, spent a tremendous amount of time and energy reading The Stranger, reading the other works of the writer, which is an interesting idea because in this book, The Stranger is treated as nonfiction. It is treated as a description of real events. That is, the murder really occurred, and it was written in first person by Meurseault. But we have here the implication that there is a tension between Meurseault, the narrator of The Stranger, and Camus, the actual author in the real world, because there are, again, references to the myth of Sisyphus, to other of Camus' writings. Harun relocates to the city of Oman, which was a city where a number of Camus' writings were set. So there is this weird tension, and because we're aware of that tension as savvy readers of this novel, we start to, and clearly Daoud knows this. Like, this is a purposeful decision on his part as an author. But it's not clear that Harun recognizes these parallels between his experience and Meursault's experience. And so that starts to raise questions for us about, is this a reliable narrator, or is this someone who has read The Stranger so many times, and it's so central to his self-conception that he's merging his experiences with Meursault's experiences? That's, I think, a significant question here. And so if we go back to this bit, I knew for sure I was looking at a reflection, but I had no idea of what. Maybe Harun is also Meursault's reflection. It's an interesting potential idea. And so that, again, raises all these interesting questions about, do we trust the things that Harun is telling us about his own life, or do we think that these are things that are inspired by or conditioned by, in some way, these are things that are shaped by Harun's reading of The Stranger, rather than an accurate representation of Harun's experience in and of itself. This raises all kinds of problems. And we get further sort of issues with this about the question of narrative reliability. Harun repeatedly says, I'm an old man, I may be making mistakes, or I may just be lying. Especially at the end of the novel, he says this pretty directly. Let me see if I can find it. I don't know. I didn't mark it, so I don't think I'm going to be able to find it. But there is a bit toward the very end where he says, basically, do you find my story suitable? It's all I can offer you. It's my word. I'm Musa's brother or nobody's. Now, that's an interesting idea. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm Musa's brother or nobody's. Just a compulsive liar you met with so you could fill up your notebooks. It's your choice, my friend. It's like the biography of God. Haha. No one has ever met him, not even Musa, and no one knows if his story is true or not. The Arab's the Arab, God's God. No name, no initials. Blue overalls and blue sky. Two unknown persons on an endless beach. Which is truer? An intimate question. It's up to you to decide. So that's an interesting thing. I mean, Harun does say of himself, just a compulsive liar you met with so you could fill up your notebooks. It's interesting. Is he Musa's brother? Was the Arab shot by Meurseault named Musa? Is any of the stuff that Harun has told us in this story true at all? It raises that interesting question again. But there's this other bit that I think is really sort of relevant and really sort of throws up major red flags about trustworthiness here. In the same section of the novel where Harun has gone to the beach that he thinks is the one on which Meurseault killed his brother, he says here, all of which is to tell you there's no point in your going to the cemetery or to Bab el Aoud or to the beach. You won't find anything. I've already tried, my friend. I told you right from the start. This story takes place somewhere in someone's head, in mine and in yours and in the heads of people like you, in a sort of beyond. What does that mean? Does that mean there was no murder at all? It's interesting. I think it's fascinating because, again, one of the things about this novel, it starts out with this very sort of, I think, somewhat basic observation, and yeah, it's linked to a bunch of larger post-colonial concerns, but this somewhat basic criticism of the stranger, that the Arab is largely erased. But then the novel raises all these really fascinating philosophical questions about truth, about the way in which identity is shaped, about the narrative reliability, about what it means to be a colonized subject, what it means to be an existential being, etc., etc. And they're just these huge, thorny problems, and the novel kind of just says, these are problems. You cannot solve them. All that you can do is decide what you think is the truth.